Okay, we know that folks are still joining and will be coming in, but we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn it over to the moderator, Amy Wilson.
Great. Thanks so much, Dean Hessler. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning if it's morning for any of you. And thank you for joining us for today, which is the last adjunct teachers in animal law session for the semester about teaching animal rights theory, philosophy, and social justice. We really are looking forward to engaging on such a very timely and important topic for lawyers, for students, for universities, and of course, law professors. I'm especially excited because we have a really excellent panel, and I have no doubt that there's going to be a lot of really good insights that will help us with our teaching and our learning. So briefly, I'm Amy P. Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of Animal Law Reform South Africa. I'm also an adjunct lecturer at several universities, both in South Africa and the USA. And I consult with the George Washington University's Animal Legal Education Initiative. And before I hand over to our really wonderful panelists to introduce themselves, I wanted to just deal with a few housekeeping issues and give a brief overview of the webinar series in case it's the first time that some of you are joining us. And if it's not, then I'm sorry you have to hear it again. The Animal Law Program at George Washington Law School established the Animal Legal Education Initiative, striving to incorporate animal law as a standalone discipline within the legal academy. This webinar series is intended to support specifically adjunct professors across the country by creating opportunities to connect, collaborate with one another, and also provide you with various resources and a support system to help you accomplish your own goals, your institutional goals, and really any sort of goals that you have. So we say this every time, but these are meant to be a conversational place, a networking platform. So we ask that if you're comfortable, you please turn on your cameras so we can see your beautiful faces, and also encourage you to ask questions and leave comments in the chat. You can also ask questions at the end. There is a bit of time as well. And if you're not talking, then please just place yourselves on mute to avoid any background noise. And yeah, also, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand at the bottom of the screen on the Zoom functionality. And if you don't know how, you can also ask us and we'll pop it into the chat. Today, we are going to be sharing practical approaches to teaching rights theory, along with legal doctrine, designing thoughtful and inclusive syllabi, and creating classroom environments that encourage respectful, critical engagement with complex ethical issues. If you've missed previous webinars, they are all recorded. This webinar is being recorded as well, and it will be posted on the GW Animal Legal Education Initiative's website and also on their YouTube channel. So you can go back and reference any of these and share with people. So I think that should be all from me. And now I'm going to hand over to our panelists. And I think I'll start with whoever's first on my screen, which is David.
Thank you. David Rosengard. I am a managing attorney in the criminal defense program at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. But to be clear, I am not speaking on their behalf, nor am I speaking on behalf of Lewis and Clark Law School, where I am an adjunct professor of animal law. I am here to speak on my behalf. And I think the other relevant piece is that I predominantly come to animal law through the lens of crime victim rights law.
Great, thank you so much. Manisha.
Hi, everyone. I'm Manisha Dacca. I'm a professor and research chair at the University of Victoria, Faculty of Law in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. I direct a research hub called the Animals in Society Research Initiative here, which is law focused, but meant to be interdisciplinary as well. I've directed a youth-oriented animal law education series that you can find on YouTube or at our Animals in Society Research Initiative website. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Manisha. Matthew.
Hi, everyone. Matthew Liebman. I am the chair of the Justice for Animals program and professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law, where I've been teaching for 5 years and change. I teach a few different animal law courses. I teach torts, and I've taught professional responsibility as well. Before that, I was a litigator at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. With David, I was in the civil litigation program as a staff attorney for about 9 years and as the director of litigation for about 3 years. So really excited to speak with you all today.
Awesome, thanks. And Samantha.
Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha. I'm a 3L at USF, University of San Francisco School of Law. I'm currently the president of our school's Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter. In this role, I work to help students to promote animal welfare and education, advocacy, and scholarship aimed at protecting the lives and advancing the interests of animals through the legal system. I'm currently working in plaintiff's law, animal law, which is really interesting. And I've previously also worked in animal agriculture as an extern. So if any other law students have any questions about either areas of the law regarding animal law, whether that be plaintiff's law or whether it be like on the litigation side or on more of the research side, please feel free to contact me. And I'm very happy to be here.
Great, and we are very happy to have you. And I think bringing that student perspective as well is especially useful. And I know she hasn't had a chance to introduce herself, and she's not a panelist, but for those that don't know, Dean Hessler, she is the Associate Dean of the Animal Legal Education Initiative. So great, I think that is everyone. So I think a good place to kind of start is we talk about animal law in a way that makes it sound like we're all in agreement as to what that means. I mean, I'm sure we all have a sense of what it means, but I think just for a framing, it's useful to know that animal law sits at the intersection of legal doctrine, moral theory, as well as social movements. And part of what we're doing today is how we teach the topic of animal law, which we'll discuss how we define in a moment, responsibly, rigorously, and safely while meeting the various goals. So before we start, perhaps we could get a sense of how you might define animal law in the context of how you teach it and also some of the classes that you do. What exactly are we teaching when we talk about animal law? And I'm not sure who wants to go first on this one. David, go ahead.
I can jump in. Yeah. So this is something that I've rolled around in my head for quite a while because it seems to me that we often mean one or more of three things when we're talking about animal law. We either mean law around animals, where the animal is there but is sort of incidental. So, for example, Pearson versus Post is a great example, famous property case where the property in question was a fox. The animal as an animal doesn't really matter in that case, but there is an animal there. And then there's law that is about animals, cases where there is something fundamental about the animal's nature that's relevant to the case. And then I think there's law advocating for animals, law that is arguing that there's something particular to animals that should be advanced in the law. And I think it's good to have clarity about those. I've come to a place where I usually describe animal law as simply at a fundamental level, standing for the proposition that animals have interests that can and should be legally cognizable. And then I encourage my students to think about how they want to situate those interests, how they weigh those interests against other interests. But it sort of begins with the notion that the animalness matters, because otherwise, what are we doing?
Great, thanks for that really thorough explanation. Does anyone want to add anything to that, or perhaps have anything to build on or disagree with it?
I'll jump in real quickly. I have the privilege of teaching 3 different animal law classes at USF, and Sam has taken or is taking all of them. So Sam, if you have anything to add after I talk, feel free. And so I think each of them does have a different set of things that we're focused on, like substantively, but also pedagogically. So the first one that I teach is your kind of run-of-the-mill, to the extent that exists, doctrinal animal law class. I use the Wagman and Frasch and Weissman casebook, and we talk about anti-cruelty laws, federal statutes involving slaughter. We look at different areas of animal use and exploitation and the laws that govern in those areas. So that's more of a sort of traditional case forward, but also statutory forward, descriptive analysis of what the law is that governs animals. And there, my goals are to think about how the law regulates animals, but also to treat it as an opportunity to sort of brush up on all those substantive areas of law, torts, criminal law, et cetera. The second class I teach is called Animals and Justice, and it is a seminar that is much more normative and theoretical. And so we're not just looking at the law that governs animals, we're thinking about how the concept of justice, what it means in the first place, and whether it should extend to non-human animals. And if it does, how would we need to reconfigure our legal system? So thinking about what are rights, what's legal personhood, what is justice, what's social justice, what's oppression, and then looking at how animal justice intersects with human social justice and the construction of various identity categories. And here I'm indebted to Manisha and her writing and teaching on these subjects long before I started. And then the third class is like a current events in animal law kind of class. It's a 1-credit pass-fail, where we're looking at recently filed complaints or newly introduced bills, and just sort of treating it almost like an entry point, kind of a grab bag of animal law topics. And there, again, is a pedagogical opportunity to look at things that involve animals, but also to, again, brush up on core areas of law. So like this week, tomorrow, we're actually looking at the DeBlaise versus Hill case, which is a New York case that recognized negligent infliction of emotional distress for a companion animal. So we're brushing up on tort law, but we're also, reading this recently published case and talking about the issues that are raised there. So I think there's a lot of different ways to teach animal law. I think everyone teaches it differently, but there is, I think, a significance to thinking about what you're teaching and then what the pedagogical objectives are for that class.
Great. So quite a variety then. So Manisha, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, Jess said, I wish that I should have the ability to teach more than one seminar. But yes, what Matthew was saying, I do integrate both, I think, all three of that, but particularly 1 and 2 of his courses into just one seminar as well. And so I've been teaching for animal law, not every year, but over about 20 years now. And I have always thought of it as trying to teach the students about what the law does say about animals and what it doesn't say. Basically, really how exploitation is facilitated and what is the pretense of kind of, trying to give animals some regard. What are the real meaningful impacts, if any, of trying to give animals more than a welfarist type of regard. And then to infuse all of that discussion with surrounded by theoretical perspectives that really come, I guess, from some of my writing over the years and others in law, but very much interdisciplinary. So being informed by what we might just call animal studies.
And I suppose I should note which courses I teach. What sounds like in parallel to Matthew, have taught a intro course, uses the same casebook, and similarly, it is covering a lot of ground in one semester, and it is just a mad dash through to the end. I've taught a animal legal research course focused on animal law, but the courses I teach most often are crimes against animals, which I teach from the perspective of positing that there are more than 2 sides to a criminal case, and that we should be interrogating criminal law and interrogating cruelty codes from the perspective of the interests of animals. So the course not only walks through sort of descriptively how animal protection laws work, but also asks normative questions about how they should work, do they create rights, and so forth. And then finally, I teach Elsie Law's Advanced Animal Seminar course, and there I actually work with the students every semester that I teach it to create the syllabus responsive to issues and questions that they identify as being particularly pertinent. So the content shifts around, but it tends to be a deeper dive into some jurisprudential issues. And the goal is really getting them to develop their own individual animal law jurisprudence.
Great. I mean, they all sound like absolutely amazing courses. So maybe I'll just shift to asking Samantha, as a student, from a law student perspective, when you took the course or a course and you heard animal law, what did you expect it to be? And has the course or courses you've taken kind of met those expectations?
Yeah, as Professor Liebman touched on, we are very fortunate at USF to have a pretty robust animal law curriculum, and I have been fortunate enough to take all of the allowed classes. I will say I had to take them a little out of order. So for me, I ended up taking the doctrinal class after I took the philosophical class, which was very interesting to me. I definitely delved more into the philosophy side and then got a better understanding of the doctrinal animal law considerations. But it didn't really matter what in which order I took them in. They were all very comprehensive and they were all very overlapping with one another, building on one another. And luckily, I got to see many peers who are also interested in animal law, and also peers who don't necessarily have an interest in animal law but wanted to take certain courses. And that's been very great to expand our networks with each other, and to just always remind everyone to have animal law on the brain when thinking about different areas of law. I'm currently taking the last of the courses, which is the policy class, the 1 unit class. And there are several other students in that class who I haven't seen in other animal law classes. So it is very great to have different perspectives. Some of my peers are looking at going into DA work or public defender work, and having the classroom kind of split up and take a certain stance on certain cases has been very eye-opening, providing different perspectives versus, as being president of SALDIF, I do see a lot of the same faces because we're all, one group, and we all have very deep passion for animals. And it's great to see everyone's faces who I've seen before, but it is also good to, in the classroom, to see other people and to hear other perspectives, and to get others kind of thinking more about animal law. And I will say that I didn't really know what the animal law classes were going to look like before taking the classes, other than maybe discussing the doctrinal foundational considerations, such as the anti-cruelty statutes and specific farming related practices. And so I will say that I have found it to be much more robust than I initially thought, only because I didn't really know if I was going to pursue animal law or not. I'm very fortunate and glad that I've been able to over my time at USF.
Great. So I think that's a really nice framing as we move into some of the more detailed discussions. And at least in all of the classes that I've taught and taken on animal law, one of the common themes and concepts is discussing the difference between animal rights and animal welfare and those kinds of things, and everything in between those approaches. So I was wondering whether you could speak a bit on how you teach these concepts, how you bring them into your course and your syllabus, and how you perhaps balance the different perspectives on either side of that spectrum and everything in between. And I'm going to ask you, Manisha, that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amy. So I definitely give them some prominence, but I start off with historical pieces that talk about actually bestiality and the law's kind of first, or early attention to human interactions with animals, and why was it this area of attention, and try to give that historical framing to introduce ideas about rights and welfare and kind of just regard for different beings. Then after that, I merge into some overview articles, mine included, that I did a few years ago for a Canadian law journal that was turning 50. They asked me to do a 50-year retrospective of how animal law developed. And of course, I had to talk a lot about the United States, to talk about Canada. And so I share with the students early on when they don't really have a lot of, knowledge about what's maybe from other courses like deontological viewpoint. What does that mean? What is a welfarist viewpoint? What does this mean? But then I put those in conversation with, like, let's say a capabilities approach and other prominent approaches, like a feminist care approach, and to show them like the wide variety. And then I talk about the strength, the why the proponents of this approach feel it's a good one. I also talk about the critiques of the approach. So the course is not so much oriented around the rights welfare debate. It's the students are first introduced to a variety of approaches, and then we go forward in our 13 weeks with them.
That's a really interesting way of doing it, and actually not one that I've come across. So yeah, really fascinating. I wonder if anyone wanted to add anything to that, either how they do it or.
Yeah, if I could just jump in real quickly, I maybe do something similar in the doctrinal class where like the first class or two are about different normative frameworks for thinking about animals, and we do, utilitarianism and rights and feminist care and capabilities. And I think from my experience, it's helpful to show the students that there are normative frameworks, whether we name them or not. And so, when we're talking about cruelty, right, what's justifiable or unjustifiable suffering is proceeding with a normative framework, regardless of whether we want to sort of recognize it as such. So to me, the way that I teach is to sort of say, and this is some of my training as a philosophy major as an undergrad, is like there's always values, percolating, and better to sort of like put the menu out on the table and sort of, at least understand that there are different ways of framing this problem. And then what we always come back to, when we start food or experiments or exhibition, we'll sort of start with like, okay, so remember our normative toolbox. What do you think is the right way to treat animals who are raised for food, or should we not raise them for food at all in the first place? And then, okay, so that's kind of the values that we have. Now let's look at what the law says, and whether you're a welfarist or a, super welfarist or an abolitionist, like, what the existing legal system is pretty far from that ideal. And so in what ways might it need to change to get closer to the ideal?
I would echo both Matthew and Manisha's outlines there. One thing that I have found additionally useful is trying to encourage students to be intentional and precise about what they mean when they say rights. And I don't, outside of my advanced seminar, I do not subject students to Wesley Newcomb-Hoffeld, because Victorian that he is, it's a pretty dry read. But I do think that whether we're using a Hoffeldian framework or otherwise, there's utility in getting students to think about what they mean when they refer to the rights of animals, or what a author means when they're referring to rights of animals, and to be intentional and clear with each other when we're discussing in class. And then to connect those frameworks back to the interests of animals and different sort of structures that have been built up historically to situate animals in the law. One of the things that Manisha's description of historical bestiality law cued for me is that I occasionally have found some utility in working with students through historical animal trials, where the animals themselves are put on trial and provided with substantive legal defenses. And I think that could be a useful thing to talk about because it's catchy. People are like, whoa, the animal was on trial. The animal had a defense attorney. This has my attention. This is surprising, but it's an opportunity to then unpack how, in these moments in time, animals are being situated as parts of the human community. animals and the law are being situated in relationship to each other, and there's a larger argument being made about how the law should apply to everyone from a rule of law perspective, and that everyone includes not just human someone's, but animal someone's.
Great, thanks. I think that animal trials are also something that my students have found really fascinating for some reason. They just kind of hang on to that. So it's great. So kind of part of today's, the purpose of today is to recognize that we are currently existing and trying to teach in environments that are quite strained and difficult right now. So including, culture wars, book bans, legislative scrutiny, all sorts of political stuff that's happening. And we, of course, are teaching law as well. And all of this would affect how we design and we teach our courses. It's really an area where kind of academic freedom meets political reality. And I think even more so for adjuncts who are less protected, let's say, in institutions like universities. So I wonder if, and I'm going to maybe ask you to start, David, as an adjunct prof, to expand on how, if at all, the current climate is affecting your teaching. Are there topics and strategies that you avoid talking about, or resources that you might avoid prescribing, or conversely amplifying? And yeah, maybe just talk a little bit about how that's impacted your teaching.
Certainly, yeah. So there aren't areas that I am put in a position of feeling obligated to avoid, and I think that's largely because I'm fortunate enough to teach as an adjunct at an institution that is, it's a private institution. It's pretty committed to giving the animal law program the latitude to do broad teaching. But I have encountered impacts from the current political situation that we are grappling with in the United States as I teach animal law. And I think part of it is students just asking at a very basic level, what are we doing if legal precedent doesn't seem to hold? How am I, as a attorney to be, as someone who aspires to work in the law, supposed to learn about the functions of law if it seems like the rule of law is under siege? And I find that a good opportunity to connect the animal law conversations we're having with larger conversations in other social justice movements and other social justice areas of law, but also the entire body of law, because if the rule of law falls apart, it all comes down. And I've also found, particularly in some of my classes that are more freeform, that one of the things to be aware of is that students may either really want to spend a lot of time talking about issues that connect to, of course, timely things happening in their lives and the news, or they may be really reluctant to, because that's a lot of potential secondary trauma to be exposed to. It's a lot of energy to unpack in a course where you may have showed up thinking, great, I get to talk about animals today. I don't have to think about the way that executive agencies relate to the courts or to lawmakers. All of which is to say, I try to be intentional about it, and I try to ensure that we have those conversations, and that we do so in a way that's mindful of other legal practitioners outside of animal law. And I know that's something we'll talk about further on. And the last thing that I've seen come up with students and that I think is relevant is grappling with how do you respond to an administration who is doing executable things, also happening to do a good thing for animals. I will often have students say, well, whatever the position in government is, has done this thing. They have reduced the amount of animals used in lab testing, or they are really committed to enforcing this portion of cruelty law. And then I think that's an opportunity for strategic conversation about why is that actually being done? What are the ramifications? And then strategically, if you're looking at it as a member of a social movement, what do you get? What does it cost you to potentially sign on in some fashion to that activity?
Great, thank you. And I'm going to switch to, we're talking about the students. So maybe Samantha, you could speak a little bit to your perspective as, somebody who's taking this, or not even just yourself, some of your peers as a law student. Given everything that's going on, what is particularly helpful for you to kind of feel supported and empowered, or just your experience going through this as a law student in 2026?
Yeah, definitely. I will say that prior to coming to USF, when I was considering what kind of law I wanted to practice, one of the more reservations that I had was presenting as a person of color. And there are certain things that you can't erase, when you look at me or when you look at people like me, and not really knowing if animal law had space for me, or in this area, if I would be able to be accepted. And I will say that just starting off my time at USF right away, USF does a great job of mixing in current political and socioeconomic perspectives, but specifically in the animal law portion, that's something that I've always felt very heard in. Being able to show up to class with um, certain things regarding the class matter, but also being able to speak to, my mentor, Professor Liebman, about things that might be affecting me as well, personally and professionally. So I think that just Professor Liebman having these spaces both in the classroom and in his office hours has definitely been very empowering, very necessary. Going into law school, things looked a little different than they do now, almost 3 years later. And so I think Professor Liebman and USF has done a great job of kind of molding with the times and making sure that we provide spaces for students like me who are looking to promote animal welfare to still feel like we can discuss things that may not necessarily be animal law related on its face, but when you go down to it, everything it can be animal law. And I think that that's something that has been really driven home with our animal law classes. And I think that's something that's very important, especially seeing and speaking with other students who are passionate about animal law and animal rights. Discussions about what's happening always come up, that they always present themselves. And I think that having these discussions in class is really good to provide that additional support, but also to show legally and educationally how these things are affecting us and are affecting our curriculum. And I will also say that I would not have had any other deep introduction to animal law or deep understanding of animal law had it not been for USF and for Professor Liebman providing these classes. I don't know of, within California, what other schools that offer such robust classes. So I do think that just having these spaces is very necessary. And especially for students of color who might feel like animal law is a predominantly white space, seeing other people there like me and like others there is can be more welcoming, a more welcoming environment when things feel very heavy.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing that. And I do also think it can depend on, where you are, the university that you're at, the state that you're in, all of those things can factor into this. I wasn't sure if Manisha or Matthew, you wanted to add anything to that. Okay, if you don't.
I would just say, I mean, being outside of the United States, it's such a different environment, especially here at my law school, in terms of lots of support for progressive initiatives. If anything, we have to make space for what are considered to be conservative viewpoints so that they can also be aired, and it's not an orthodoxy on the other sense. So yeah, it is really specific. So it doesn't luckily get pegged into any type of polarized debate or cultural wars too much.
I have
I do.
heard from some adjuncts else at particularly some public universities that given their university's stances and reactions politically, they have felt their coursework has been constrained. And I realized that because of the very nature of that concern, like the odds of any of those people being able to speak up in this video and say that are pretty minimal because that's the problem. They feel constrained. And I think it's worth acknowledging that there are institutions that have responsive to political pressure, particularly with the institution is itself a public institution that is subject to different statutes and funding from the legislature, made it more difficult for people to teach broadly. And I think that it's worth being there to support those of our counterparts and our colleagues who are working in those environments, and also recognizing that by its very nature, I would say that animal law encourages students to think critically about the law, because fundamentally we're arguing that the way the law traditionally has been conceived of isn't adequate. And so even if you are in a position where you cannot teach everything in the animal law segment that you would like, you are probably still being productive in terms of the impacts on your students. And then you need to individually decide at what point you've hit a line where you are no longer able to function in that environment.
Thank you. I wasn't sure if Matthew, you were wanting to add something to that.
No, well, yeah, I think I just want to underline how like frightening it is that this is a question and conversation that we have to have. And I understand why you asked the question, Amy, but like, yeah, I just think it's really terrifying, and we should name it as such, that people don't feel free to teach the way that they think the information is best conveyed, and that we should all do everything within our power to denormalize what we're experiencing right now.
Right. Thank you for that. So many of us are teaching this subject because we care deeply about the subject matter. We care about animals. Not necessarily the case for everyone who teaches animal law, but I'd say it's a pretty common thread. And that's maybe a little bit different to somebody who's teaching kind of property law, not to speak for all property law profs. So one of the things that I've struggled with myself, and I'd love to get some perspective on, is whether and to what extent neutrality is possible and or even desirable, and how much your own views are coming into your syllabus and your teaching, if at all, and how does this then help you design your syllabus? So I'm going to start with you, Matthew.
Yeah, so I think neutrality is a good value for a professor to have. Whether it's, possible, I think is debatable. I do think, my role as a law professor is very different than my role as a litigator at ALDF. But, the students know my background. And so I think they appreciate the transparency. And what I tell them is, certainly, in the doctrinal class, like it's not, my opinion on what the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act says, it's not at all relevant. It's what the statute says and how it's been interpreted by courts and that sort of thing. So for the descriptive doctrinal classes, I'm happy to sort of like tell students what I think, where I see the law failing, why it doesn't accord with my own belief. But at the end of the day, what I really am testing them on and want them to understand is what is the law that governs animals. The seminar is a little bit different because it is values-based and theoretical. And so in that class, I do want to, as Manisha was saying, sort of hold space for different perspectives and different views. I think it is really valuable for people to, for those conversations to come up. And sometimes I do find myself, suggesting positions that I don't myself hold, just to keep the conversation from orthodoxy, from being sort of boring, because the people who opt into taking that class are going to be people who do have, some priors that align with my own. So, I think transparency about who you are and where you're coming from is fine. I also think it's good to sort of make sure that the robust exchange of ideas is happening despite that.
Great. So I'm not sure, David or Manisha, whether you had other thoughts on professors' own views in teaching animal law.
I would agree with Matthew was just saying. I try technique and try to at a heightened way, I think, this semester to allow the students to really articulate their views in terms of asking them to do participatory like mini talks. So, and often, like this is actually the first semester I've done this where I've assigned I think three of my own readings in different parts. And I say, and I encourage them, like you can, it will be boring if you just say you're right. You need to disagree and critique and present your thesis to your peers in two premises. And I will be delighted if you can disagree with me. So I say this, but of course, I realize there's still pressure. But then there are other people in the mix too. It's not just me. And we had four classes where they had like 3 minutes to give their opinion on the arguments. And I found that was quite well received and worked well and just gave everyone a time to say something that they want to say. So that, I mean, often I find what's changed, and I think this is like the social media pressure and kind of peer pressures out there now that are quite different, that it may have been at one point that the students were afraid of disagreeing with me, but I think now it's more like the students are afraid of what their peers will think of them. And I found that this worked well in just in letting people really say what they wanted. And then I do like a classroom guidelines session, like peer generated, student generated in the beginning, collaboratively done, and to talk about, we don't all want to believe the same thing and the importance of that and the importance of being able to hear a critique, and that's what the university is for, and work with it and be able to respond to it. So I do scaffold it with that discussion first.
I would second all of that. In terms of additional techniques that I have found useful, if the space in the syllabus allows it, something that I've had some success with is earlier in the semester assigning students a brief paper topic. They'll end up writing, I don't know, 5 to 8 pages on um, what they think the status of animals should be, or whatever the topic may be. And then I will anonymize all of those, and we will use them as reading in another course, later in the same course in a different session, which seems to give students a permission structure to discuss ideas without having to feel either identified with a particular perspective or that they are attacking anyone else's perspective. It seemed to open up the discussion a little bit when I've done that, which has been kind of cool. I also have gotten some utility out of asking students to very intentionally argue from the perspective of parties and participants who are adverse to the sort of position that many of the students take. So, for example, in my Crimes Against Animals course, there is an assignment where I ask students to occupy the position of a lobbyist for animal exploitative industries and make their best arguments for what they want the legislation in their jurisdiction to be. And I find that useful instructionally, because I think it gives people a chance to really dig into what the best opposition arguments are and identify holes in those. But I also think it is a useful way to get students to think about where fracture points in different political coalitions may be, which for those of my students who are more interested in policy or political work seems to be useful.
Great, thank you. And maybe Samantha, I'll just ask you, because we've spoken a bit about student views and professor views, if you could just maybe reflect on that question, whether you, from a student perspective, think that it's useful to know where your professor stands, and or some of these exercises around your peers.
Yeah, just to kind of echo what the other panelists were saying, I do think that there is an important aspect, maybe in like more so the seminar classes, to get an understanding of personal perspectives of everyone. The good thing is that in our animal law seminar, the Animals and Justice class, we were all given topics, or we all chose topics to write about. And for the most part, everyone's was very different. So there was a introduction to different topics and different perspectives, but there was also an understanding of the prompt was, what is a specific like animals and justice related issue? It doesn't necessarily say you have to take a stance on it or you have to provide your own opinion, but in doing the research, you kind of formulate your own opinion. And I think I appreciate that structure in the seminar classes. I personally like to know where my animal law professor stands on certain topics, just as a personal matter. But I will say that I'm not sure if Professor Lieben mentioned this, but he has previously taught the professional responsibility class. And that really does show, I think, the emphasis on professional responsibility and transparency that he takes in all of his classes. And I'll say also that kind of speaking to some of the other things that were mentioned in our seminar class, we did have the opportunity to read each other's papers on different occasions and read each other's theses as well to workshop them. And I think that that was a very good exercise in breaking down that insecurity wall of having other people read your work and your perspectives. And I think that that was a really good way to show that we all don't have to agree on the same things, but it is good to know where you're coming from and what research that you did that led you to a specific topic. So that's kind of how I see it in terms of like transparency and fairness. And of course, all of our finals for like the doctrinal class is anonymous. So everything in that regard is kept very fair and very on its face, very transparent.
Great. So I think we've had a lot of really good discussion. We had a lot of topics planned that I'm not sure we'll get to in the time. And I also want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. So I'm going to ask perhaps if you have any questions from the audience on the topic, whether you could either raise your hand now or perhaps start writing it in the chat just to get a sense of any unanswered questions. Otherwise, we'll continue along the same trajectory with our topics. Okay, I'll give you some time to think about it and pop some in the chat, but maybe just for the panelists, we might just stick to like short kind of lightning style questions, sound bites if you can. So one of the important things obviously is designing your syllabus and figuring out whose voices count. So I wanted to ask you, Manisha, a little bit around how you design your syllabus to include these different considerations.
Well, I mean, I teach what I know very well, which is feminist theory and post-colonial theory. And that are probably the most prominent voices in the syllabus. And so it just kind of naturally comes into the syllabus. And then I try to be attentive to trying to feature an article that discusses the more like identity factors or social locations that may not be in those other works, or to bring in scholarly voices where the scholar themselves are talking about this and identify from that. It's really not so formulaic, but I do like go over the syllabus to make sure that I'm bringing in authors who have a diverse location, and also that the topics, even more so, are diversely situated, because I really want the students to leave with a good understanding of different frameworks and approaches to animals and why they matter.
Yeah, amazing. And we have a lot of really excellent resources, some of which we can talk about later. So another important question in addition to syllabus design is creating, of course, a very safe and inclusive classroom space. So perhaps, Matthew, you could talk a little bit about how you create or try to create a safe space in your classroom.
Yeah, I mean, I think the term safe space is sort of, controversial or my goal is not safety per se. So maybe empowered space would be the better way to think of it. Like, I think people should feel a little bit of risk in venturing opinions and having conversations and being critiqued. I don't know that that necessarily needs to feel comfortable. I think the problem, not to sound like an old man, but like the problem is that people are less comfortable feeling uncomfortable, to generalize a whole generation. But like, I want people to feel a little bit of like tension in the classroom, but I also want them to feel empowered to say what they mean, what they think, to receive that criticism. And so how do you do that? I don't know that I've cracked the code per se. But basically I want, I do, like Manisha said, sort of start off the classroom, the session, with a bit of like collective discussion about like, when have you felt comfortable speaking up in class? When have you felt discouraged from speaking up in class? What classes, what can a professor do to make you feel like comfortable sharing your opinion? I ask them, how do you like to be disagreed with? And I think sort of having folks share those kinds of answers to those questions can at least get us roughly on the same page. And usually the kind of guidelines we draw out of that conversation are pretty similar from year to year. And it's things like give people the benefit of the doubt, don't assume ill intent, but also take responsibility for consequences, even in the absence of ill intent. So things like that. I think sort of having those conversations openly at the beginning of the semester can be really helpful for setting the groundwork. And then inviting people into the conversation is the other thing that I find I have to do a lot. Especially in a seminar, my normal classes, I do Socratic, cold call. The seminar, I like to be conversational, but I do also sort of notice when someone hasn't chimed in, and I do weekly reflection journals. And so that way, like, I know if, what someone is thinking about the material, even if they haven't raised their hand. And so I can sort of say, hey, you wrote, you haven't said anything, but you wrote in your journal, that you thought this part of the article was really interesting or confusing or whatever. And I think that can invite people into the conversation.
Great. And yeah, just again at this time, if anyone has any thoughts or questions, you are very welcome to raise your hand or place them in the chat. We really do encourage you to ask them. Oh, good. We got one. Okay. Do you think the law is a structure that determines the behavior of both animals and humans? If not, then is law a process through which human and animal policy making act on the base of free will? If a law is a structure that determines how humans ought to behave with animals, then how do you conceptually measure law? If law is abstract thinking, then how is it possible to define what animal and human law is? Okay, who wants to take that one on?
There's a lot to unpack in that. I'm pausing for a moment because my sense is that we've got a number of interrelated but very big questions. And in my experience, these sorts of questions are going to have differing levels of relevance depending on the class, the course being taught. So, for example, if I've been teaching my introduction course, the kind of doctrinal course that others have spoken about, we probably aren't going to get into the philosophy of free will or the jurisprudence of whether there is an ideal law out there waiting to be discovered in a Platonic sense, or whether the law is simply what government says. I say we probably won't do that, but like it'll come up at some point because I can't help myself. That said, in terms of answering some of your questions, I, again, don't see myself as being in the room to tell students there is one perfect jurisprudence. I'm not there to argue for a grand unified field theory of law. I am there to encourage my students to identify and begin working on their jurisprudence with the idea that they will be refining their jurisprudence throughout the rest of their lives as members of the legal community, and that we will never, none of us individually will ever reach a perfect understanding of law, and we as a society may never reach a perfect place of law, but our duty is to always be trying to improve it. So, to your question of how do we conceptually measure law, and how do we define what law is, I would tend to say that law is the system by which society operates, and we evaluate it according to how to some of the moral issues that others have brought up, how equitable it is, how just it is, how transparent it is. Does it actually do the things it sets out to do? Which I think can be a good way to bring that kind of broad question back to specific grounded animal issues. So, for example, there's consistent data that demonstrates that even individuals who consume animal products want the animals whose lives result in those products, whose exploitation results in those products. They want those animals to be treated to a certain standard of care. We also know from the same data that those people vastly overestimate how well the animals are treated and what the law requires. So, at a very basic level, if we're evaluating the law by asking, does the law achieve its goals? I think we could say that that's a place the law does not achieve its goals. If society consistently overestimates what the law is doing for animals, and that's an opportunity for change and reform.
Great. Well, I think we've solved all the problems of the world. Just kidding. So I see we have, I don't think we have any more questions. And before we close, I just also wanted to give Samantha an opportunity whether there was anything left unsaid from any of the other questions that perhaps you wanted to chime in just in the last couple of minutes before we close.
Yeah, thank you. Just really quickly, I wanted to touch briefly on the creating a safe space and inclusive classroom. I just also wanted to highlight a few things that Professor Liebman didn't really discuss that I, as a student, have picked up on. And I think a lot of other students can agree as well. And one of the main things is that language matters. So this is both in the classroom and just in your own free time. One of the things that Professor Liebman always professionally wants to ensure is that, you know, when we say certain things like beat a dead horse or kill two birds with one stone, you know, making sure that we correct that language to be animal inclusive, you know, feed a fed horse, feed two birds with one stone. So that's something kind of silly or like playful that I think is actually very, very impactful, as well as a minute of mindfulness that we do before every class. I think that sets the tone and it really provides a space for grounding that I think is really important. And then, sorry, just the last thing, through the Justice for Animals Scholars Program, Professor Liebman has invited authors of animal law related books to come and speak. And I think that that's a very important thing right now when we have book bans happening and authoritarian feelings coming into education. I think that having that space is really important. So I just wanted to emphasize that those are things that as a student I have seen, and these intersections are very important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I wish we could have more time to unpack all of that because there's so much in there, you know, in terms of just language and all these other things. So I guess we'll have to pick it up in next semester's sessions, but it really has been a really rich discussion. So I wanted to kind of thank the panelists for all of your insights and, of course, everyone at GW and all of you who have come to listen and kind of percolate these ideas and, you know, just recognize that we are, you know, navigating real world situations as we teach here, and we have a long way to go, but hopefully we can do it together. And just wanted to do a quick reminder that GW is hosting a pedagogy workshop next weekend, actually, for those that might want to learn a little bit more and are willing and able to travel to Washington, D.C. It's on Friday and Saturday. We are still accepting registrations, and I've popped the link into the chat for anyone who might be interested so we can discuss some of the stuff more. But otherwise, we welcome and encourage you to email us with questions. And yeah, just a huge thank you to everyone. Really appreciate it.